One day in 1996, the year after Mortal Kombat 3 came out, my doorbell rang and I opened it to see Sean, my childhood friend who lived at the far side of Wilmington Island. It wasn't much of a surprise. Many of our afternoons involved meeting up for one reason or another, but what was surprising that day was his crutches. He had broken his ankle in some sort of skateboard-related accident, he told me, but that didn't matter. I asked him if he walked the entire way here, nearly a mile or so on crutches, and he ignored me again, saying, "It doesn't matter. I know how to turn Sindel into a moth." It took us a good hour, but he wasn't lying. First was the revelation of the mercy that could be performed only if both players had won a match, and then afterwards the trying and retrying to perform the button codes in the brief seconds before the window closed and you had to wait at least another 3 rounds before you could try again. But finally we had done it. We turned Sindel into a moth. I walked Sean back to his house shortly afterwards. The walk there and back on crutches had used up most of our desired childhood time, but the way back was exuberant and jovial, with both of us guessing who else we could turn into animals, and if so, what kind. This is the magic of Mortal Kombat games as it relates to me, and, I suspect, many of you. I can't speak for everyone, only the other late 20 to mid 30-somethings that I suppose the media would classify as millennials, but we'd all prefer the term Generation Z. The purist and cranky snob in me wonders even if Mortal Kombat holds the same appeal these days, with moves list readily available and internet gaming sites spoiling the juiciest secrets just hours after the release. And I can't know for sure, for such is the case of growing older. I too could simply turn off the computer, not check an RSS feed, ignore my Twitter, and I could experience the game without any preconceived notions. But it's an inverted argument. In the old days I didn't have to go out of my way to avoid content, but to find it. The joy of running across a hint or a cheat code in a magazine, that's something I wish I could bottle, that frantic trying to memorize or write down the code somewhere before it was time to leave the store. Such a moment becomes unreplicatable in the days where cameras are attached to our phones and attached to us. When I first started this project, I began with a very simple question. What makes Mortal Kombat fun? There are a number of different but similar fighting games on the market, both now and then, but why does Mortal Kombat continue to grow and evolve while other fighting games wallow and stagnate and disappear? To answer this, I came up with 3 overarching reasons, each of them containing and representing multiple aspects of the game. The first is catharsis. Violence, gore, ridiculous excess, and immoral behavior, executed in such a way that it could never be taken seriously, is a healthy release for both stress and anger. Mortal Kombat is B-movie schlock elevated by slick execution. It's the Quentin Tarantino of video games. This comparison leads us into the second reason. Story. The Mortal Kombat lore has been in constant continuity for 27 years, weaving in and out of mediums with the games influencing the movies and TV shows and those in turn influencing the games. Kano was never even meant to be Australian after all, but Trevor Goddard did such an iconic performance that he had to be such from then on. The series has gone on so long that most of the original main characters have either retired or been replaced by their children, although that hasn't stopped developers from coming up with contrived reasons for bringing back all the fan favorites time and time again.
One of the interesting aspects of MK11's story with the time folding is that you get to see so many interesting interactions between young and old versions of themselves.
The thought of becoming you sickens me.
The story of Mortal Kombat is most closely related to that of a comic book, with time travel, long-lost siblings, prophets, destinies, and superpowers all being main plot points. And while current generation MK games boast what they call a story mode, hardcore players know that the true endings are hidden in the arcade mode. Which brings me to my third point. Secrets. Mortal Kombat, more than any other game series, knew how to utilize the rumor mill that their fans would create. What other game developers have created characters purely to satisfy the hardcore nuts who thought that the shorthand for error macro meant something significant? Or used fan names for background characters and later incorporated those same characters into the game's canon? There are also hidden characters that require a downright malicious amount of prerequisites in order to be able to even face once. And later on, entire rooms filled with unlockable videos, concept art, and humorous content, all with a K. Not only would you unlock trivial content and extra gameplay, but you would be able to flesh out the characters and their motivations behind the actions. Secrets, story, catharsis. These are the 3 tenets that the Mortal Kombat series rests on. But they all balance atop a fourth, more important pillar, that makes each separate aspect better just by existing. Sharing your experience with a friend. I'll never forget the day that Sean walked over a mile on crutches to my house in order to tell me that he found out how to turn Sindel into a moth, or the speculations on other animalities we had on the walk back to his. Online play simply can't replicate this feeling. Sure, you can fight against someone else on the other side of the world, but you can't take turns passing the controller back and forth with them as you both try to win a fight using only low kicks. You can't punch your friend in the face when they get a flawless victory against you, or try over and over again to beat Shao Kahn on master difficulty with them. But again, this could simply be my old man mentality showing. I've been with the Mortal Kombat series since its inception. In fact, one could say that I grew up together with the series, as Mortal Kombat for the SNES was part of the first bundle of games I ever personally owned, along with Super Mario World and Jurassic Park. However hard it may be to control my hatred of things like moves lists on pause screens, I will endeavor to do my best in the interest of scientific indifference. So, besides the violence, what makes Mortal Kombat different from Street Fighter or Soul Calibur or any other fighting game with a story? Like I said, I played the MK series all my life, but I would never consider myself good at fighting games. I'm good at Mortal Kombat, sure, but you put me in front of Street Fighter or Soul Calibur or even Smash Brothers, and I wouldn't really be able to do anything other than button mash. Try to figure out how to block. Not only is it the only game I can remember all the moves to, but Mortal Kombat is the only game I ever cared to learn about. There's an instinctiveness to the way that MK codes its combos and special moves, something that's so specifically intuitive to my own peculiar playstyle that grabs me and wraps me in the heavy metal blanket of violent nonsense that it is. It wasn't just the games either. Early and mid-90s Mortal Kombat was splattered over all kinds of pop culture, and even though the creators said they weren't trying to market violence to children, one need only look at the Saturday morning cartoon show Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Realm to know that's not true.
Much has changed since the last Mortal Kombat tournament. Dark forces of Outworld have begun invading the Earth realm. These attacks are seriously weakening Earth's dimensional fabric, enabling not only Outworlders to enter the Earth realm, but warriors from other domains as well.
While tame and poorly written, Defenders of the Realm did something that struck a chord with young players. It hinted at a bigger world. Mortal Kombat 1 took place exclusively on an Asiatic island, MK2 in the realm of Outworld, and MK3 in a mix between the two. As a lead-in/side-along piece to MK3, Defenders of the Realm also introduced new enemies and races exclusive to the television show. For someone already interested in the universe of Mortal Kombat, these new tidbits were gems. The story takes center stage these days, with the past 2 games and upcoming 11 having fully voiced and animated movie-length cutscenes in a full so-called story mode. This is a recent addition, though, part of the brand remake that happened after Midway closed, NetherRealm Studios began, and Warner Brothers fully stepped in. Before then, the 7 main Mortal Kombat games were not, as a rule, story-driven. They were fighters of the arcade caliber, featuring towers and verses, and for the first 4 games, that was about it. The story was always there, of course, but you had to put it together yourself through character biographies, tower endings, dialogues, character and environment designs, and the proverbial words of Raiden that would appear on the splash screen. It was an obtuse but defined, unobtrusive but visible, and it left just enough to the imagination to leave players feeling intrigued about what else was out there. It's almost a cliche at this point to reference Dark Souls when talking about anything, but the way that the Soulsborne games develop their worlds and story through environments and item descriptions is the most analogous experience I've had in recent history. This wouldn't last, however.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
The brand named most was Camel. Yes, surveys show more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
After Mortal Kombat 3 and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 and Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Midway tried to capitalize in a different way on the popularity of Mortal Kombat's lore with MK Mythology's Sub-Zero. Although interesting in its own right, the Mortal Kombat engine was unprepared for 2D exploration, and it was critically derided for poor gameplay decisions, including, among a myriad of other things, a dedicated button that had to be pressed in order to change direction. This was the first time, however, that players were introduced to the now famous characters of Quan Chi, Shinnok, Fujin, Serena, and Blaze, as well as fleshing out and solidifying not only the backstories of the two most famous MK characters, Sub-Zero and Scorpion, but perhaps its most important job was setting the stage for the events of the next game in the series, now fully 3D for the first time ever, Mortal Kombat 4. Looking back on Mortal Kombat 4 now, 21 years later, I can't remember the exact point my disappointment with it began. Was it the very first time I played it, at the eerily quiet arcade at the Oglethorpe Mall? I chose Sub-Zero first and was immediately confused at the 3D controls. I kept trying to down-forward low punch, but instead of freezing, he would simply step towards the camera, rotating the fight towards me. It took a few quarters to get the hang of it, but something was off. The timing felt wrong, not at all helped by the janky animations of the blocky 3D characters that felt ripped straight from War Gods.
First time I ever played Mortal Kombat, it was Mortal Kombat 1 on the arcade cabinet. It was at a bar in Jacksonville called Calico Jack's. I think that was the name of it.
How old were you in this bar?
I was probably less than 10. My dad went there for dinner, took me to have dinner.
At the bar?
At the bar.
How was the dinner there at the bar?
I don't remember the dinner at the bar.
Peanuts and buffalo wings?
Probably. My dad was a classy individual, but we in the back they had an arcade cabinet with Mortal Kombat in it, and it was fun. I was a wee little lad, so that amount of violence was appealing. And it's funny to look back at that and think of that as, you know, crazy violent when it's just a few drops of blood coming out of somebody.
It's barely even blood.
Yeah.
You know, it's just red sprites on the screen. 1997 brought many games now considered unquestionable classics in the gaming world. Final Fantasy VII, GoldenEye, Mario Kart 64, Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Alright, maybe not that last one, but come on, there's so few fun dinosaur games. However, one thing all these games have in common is that, although just as polygonal as Mortal Kombat 4, they had gameplay enjoyable enough to keep the player's disbelief properly suspended. Mortal Kombat 4, with its poorly voiced story endings and unattractive character models, needed good, solid gameplay in order to stay relevant. And when it was released in home consoles in 1998, a year after its arcade release, sales were well enough for Midway to consider it a success, but the game received middling critical reviews and did not resonate with fans the way Mortal Kombat's 1, 2, and 3 did. It felt weird. The series had also begun to suffer from overexposure, and the best unremembered game, Mortal Kombat Special Forces, sold so poorly that the entire Mortal Kombat franchise was put on hold by Midway in order to regroup and focus their efforts somewhere else. For 4 years then, from 1998 to 2002, we were without a mainstream Mortal Kombat game, with Mythologies, Gold, and Special Forces hanging over the series like a literary fish. When Deadly Alliance arrived in late November 2002, it had to not only reintroduce the series to a new generation, but prove that the now decades-old series had something new worth saying. It's no surprise, then, that Deadly Alliance's first job is to kill off both the main antagonist and the main protagonist in the game's opening cutscene. Getting rid of iconic characters like Shao Kahn and Liu Kang was a great metaphor for turning over a new leaf, And it was only the beginning, as Deadly Alliance introduced a system of various fighting styles that players could switch between mid-battle. Weapons returned from Mortal Kombat 4, but many other features were notably absent, like the ability to run and numerous special moves and fatalities, now only one per character. While rough around the edges, Deadly Alliance became the testing ground for a trend that still continues within the Mortal Kombat games. Throwing a bunch of random ideas together with each new installment and just seeing what works. Test Your Might, a minigame for Mortal Kombat 1, returns here for the first time, as well as a similarly titled Test Your Sight game, which is a cup and ball 3-card Monty. Deadly Alliance is also the birthplace of the Crypt, the Mortal Kombat team's answer to the prevalence of internet cheat code sharing. The Crypt is genius. Even if you go look online to find out where the character, costume, or whatever is located in the giant room of coffins, you still have to play the game long enough to be able to afford it. Each fight, combo, fatality that you do nets you a certain number of coins, and although this particular game featured far too many types of currency, this is still a lovely idea. On top of all that, other coffins that are nothing more than red herrings will still contain behind-the-scenes artwork, photos, and the occasional Easter egg.
This week on Cooking with Scorpion, learn about chopping, tenderizing, chopping, cake decorating, and chopping.
Another feature new in Deadly Alliance is Conquest Mode. Essentially a series of training rooms for each character, Conquest displayed the image of a monk traveling from tower to tower as the story and motivations behind Deadly Alliance unfold. While simplistic, Conquest offered new and returning players alike the chance to not only learn the new 3D fighting mechanics, but to truly understand, many of them for the first time, the reason behind the violence. Not surprisingly, Deadly Alliance was well received, and when the sequel, Deception, was released 2 years later, it took all of these new ideas and expanded on them. More characters, more finishers, more weapons. Of all things, Deception's Crypt received the least amount of updates. Now, in addition to just 6 flavors of combat coins, certain coffins are locked by special keys that are only available in the Conquest mode, and it's this iteration of Conquest mode that received the most amount of improvements. No longer a simple training simulator, this version of Conquest mode was a fully realized RPG that put players in the shoes of new game protagonist Shujinko, a young Shaolin warrior that was tasked with retrieving 6 mysterious Kamidogu, emblems of the Elder Gods, in a journey that takes him through 6 realms in the Mortal Kombat universe and throughout 60 years of the game's history. In a largely divided decision, many characters, outfits, and levels that were available in Deadly Alliance as purchasable by coins alone were now locked with keys that could only be found by playing the Conquest mode for a multitude of hours. For some players, this was fine, but others resented being forced to play an RPG, and a somewhat empty and lengthy one at that, in order to unlock the full content in a fighting game they thought they had purchased. In the minigames area, Mortal Kombat Deception also featured chess and puzzle combat, recreations of Battle Chess and Dr. Mario with a Mortal Kombat reskin. While bigger, Deception did little to add to the fighting styles already established in Deadly Alliance, and besides the revamped introduction of stage hazards and fatalities, the fights played out relatively the same way.
Want to give up strong-tasting cigarettes?
Treat your taste kindly with Kent.
Want to give up harsh-tasting cigarettes?
Treat your taste kindly with Kent.
Want to give up rough-tasting cigarettes?
Treat your taste kindly with Kent. Smoke Kent, the micronite filter cigarette.
Yes, Kent lets you get away from cigarettes that sometimes taste too strong, too harsh, too rough. Because Kent, with the new micronite filter, refines away harsh flavor, refines away rough taste for the mildest taste of all. If you want to get away from strong, harsh-tasting cigarettes, now's the time to change to Kent, the cigarette that made the filter famous. Remember, the finer the filter, the milder the taste.
Treat your taste kindly with Kent. Smoke Kent, the micronite filter cigarette.
2 years later, MK Armageddon continued this tradition of fully 3D combat with fighting styles and weapons, and also continued the idea of bigger is better by including every character that has appeared in the series as a playable fighter so far. If that still wasn't enough for you, players could also create their own fighter in a Tony Hawk-style character customization mode. This create-your-own idea even spreads into the gameplay, with the now normal fatalities being replaced with a generic Dial of Fatality option. This was a mistake, and I want to take a moment to talk about why. A fatality is, in its most accurate and purest form, equal parts victorious celebration and rapid characterization. It should be excessive and joyful, and it should be executed, pun intended, in such a manner as to be immediately representative of the character performing it. Liu Kang turning into a dragon, Scorpion breathing fire, Quan Chi ripping off his opponent's leg and beating them to death with it. These are all just as much character building moments as they are cathartic displays of ridiculousness. The Dial of Fatality option in Mortal Kombat Armageddon reserves any sort of semblance or nuance from the finishing moves, and because of this they feel generic and often repetitive. Adding to this, the vast number of playable characters may seem like great fan service at first, but quickly a player will begin to realize that many of them play functionally identical to each other, and a number of moves are shared between fighters. Still, the appearance of such fan-favorite characters like Chameleon and Mataro, albeit on 2 legs, was enough to please the majority of the game's fans. Instead of puzzle or chess combat, this game's gimmick was combat racing, a Mario Kart reskin that controlled adequately and was there. Armageddon also featured the last iteration of Conquest Mode, this time being a blend of Deception's adventure roaming and the earlier Shaolin Monk's linear narrative and fighting style. Having learned their lesson from MK Deception, Armageddon's Conquest is much more action-focused, with less emphasis on hidden secrets, and crucially, all of the playable fighters, save for the 2 featured in the story, are unlocked from the start. As for the actual story and plot goes, Armageddon is the video game equivalent of turning your toy box upside down in the middle of your bedroom floor and shouting, "Okay, now they all just fight each other!" As much as anyone loves the lore and history of Mortal Kombat, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who thinks that a giant pyramid with god-granting powers at the top currently controlled by a fire elemental turned egg guardian isn't just a tiny bit contrived.
Yep, and some of that was blood flying there. Now, with us tonight is the creator of the Mortal Kombat videos, Ed Boon, who's sitting right next to me, and John Tobias. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
You know, as these things evolve, parents are getting a bit concerned because they get more and more graphic, and they are accusing you, or at least other critics as well, that you're marketing gratuitous violence with real no end in sight. I mean, the games do nothing except sit there and you watch people die. Are you?
Absolutely not. I mean, what we provide is a form of entertainment in the form of a video game. The violent aspect of the video game is, you know, is a minor aspect in the overall scheme of the game itself. The players, I think, are aware of that. We're aware of that. Maybe somebody looking on the outside, unfamiliar with the game itself.
What do kids learn, Mr. Boone, out of this? What do they learn?
There's no learning value. It's just like any other form of entertainment. There's just you go there to have fun, and you go there to play the game. Most of the people who critics of the game haven't even played the game, and they don't realize that exactly what points of the game there's violent aspects of it.
We see kids looking at violent, increasingly violent movies. They see a lot of violence in the news. They see a lot of violence on TV. Why do they need more of it? I mean, are you concerned at all that they're being overexposed to violence, with perhaps the idea or the residual effect being that they become desensitized to watching people die, because all they have to do is push a button and it starts again?
There's a lot of parallels, exactly like you said, with movies, and that's why a couple of years ago there was a rating system that our industry kind of came up with, similar to the rating systems that you have in movies, and that provides parents and other players, for instance, the knowledge they need as to the content of the game, and they can make their own decisions as to whether they feel that's appropriate.
Is there going to be a Mortal Kombat 4, and will you ever draw the line where you say it's too violent?
Yeah, there's of course we're going to draw the line. Okay. Certainly, yeah.
All right, Mr. Boone, Mr. Tobias, you're very young guys, huh?
Thank you.
All right.
Armageddon would be the last main entry in the Mortal Kombat franchise for some time. 2 years later, in 2008, the crossover Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe was released, and although it was unknown at the time, would serve as a roadmap for future games made by the MK development team. This would be Midway's last entry in the franchise, however. The company folded a year later, and the Mortal Kombat license, along with the team behind the games, led by series co-creator Ed Boon, was sold to Warner Brothers, convenient owner of the DC licensed products. Besides the obvious allusions to the Injustice series, Mortal Kombat vs. DC also premiered the use of a dedicated story mode in which the plot of the game's events are told cinematically, with all of the battles stemming semi-organically in sequential order as the story progresses. The game was received well for the novelty of it, improved fighting mechanics, next-gen graphics, and the return to fighting on a 2D plane, but the lack of satisfying gore due to the teen-rated nature of comic book heroes and the absence of proper MK-style hidden content made the game feel like a poor shadow of a proper Mortal Kombat sequel. Fans would have to wait 3 more years after that to get one.
Fight!
In 2011, the newly rebranded NetherRealm Studios released Mortal Kombat. You may have thought that happened in 1992, and you'd be right. So is this a re-release? No, it's clearly a new game. So is it a reboot then? No, it follows the story directly after Mortal Kombat Armageddon, although it does retell the stories of Mortal Kombat's 1 through 3, albeit with some pretty drastic left turns. History has taken it to calling it Mortal Kombat 9 for simplicity's sake, or Mortal Kombat (2011). Mortal Kombat 9's story seems important at the start, but is really just an excuse to get away from the convoluted nonsense of Armageddon and retell the series fresh, years before The Force Awakens would get credit for doing basically the same thing.
Our job's done here. Let's go home.
The most notable gimmick in Mortal Kombat 9 is truly a series high point, the 2-on-2 matches. Originally a feature in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 for the SNES, 2v2 fights had integrated strategy and teamwork in ways rarely seen in Mortal Kombat games previous, and allowed up to 4 people to participate in a single match. The story mode, even more lengthy and cinematic than MK vs. DC's, although now lacking the ability to choose a good or evil side, was praised for the quality of its writing and animation, with many people calling it the best Mortal Kombat story since the first 1995 movie. The gameplay was improved from MK vs. DC as well, and the addition of X-rays allowed a certain amount of special meter management that had not previously been in the series. Fans also praised the return of series favorites like Babalities, hidden character fights, and Shao Kahn as the main villain. One of the few returning features from the PlayStation 2 area, the Crypt, received a massive overhaul as well. No longer a simple room full of unlockable coffins, the Crypt in Mortal Kombat 9 is now a fully traversable area, complete with multiple types of terrain and featuring, instead of simple coffins, twisted, tortured humans that serve as chests. It's grotesque, ridiculous, and the epitome of Mortal Kombat. This was the apex of the Mortal Kombat story so far. Mortal Kombat has always had a loyal fan base, but they weren't as loud or as numerous as fans of the other fighting games like Street Fighter, Soul Calibur, and Tekken. Mortal Kombat 9 made Mortal Kombat mainstream once again, for the first time since the mid-90s, and once Warner Brothers realized the potential of their new property, the DLC packs began. Scarlet, yet another untrue fan rumor turned actual character a la Ermac and Tremor, along with Rain, Kenshi, Kratos from God of War, Freddy Krueger from his movies, these are all available as extra purchasable characters. Extra purchasable, not unlockable. All the characters are unlocked from the start, save for a few dramatic story reveal characters, and Kratos and Freddy Krueger are just on loan for the WB. Now these are the first guest characters that Mortal Kombat has ever had, not counting MK vs. DC, but they wouldn't be the last.
What cigarette do you smoke? You'll be interested to know how the doctors of America answered that question. Tens of thousands of doctors in all parts of the country, in every state of the Union. Doctors in every branch of medicine were asked,
"What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?"
In this nationwide survey of general practitioners, surgeons, throat specialists, diagnosticians, and so on, the brand named most was Camel.
Yes, according to this survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Try Camels yourself. Make the one sensible cigarette test. Make your own 30-day Camel mildness test in your T-zone. Smoke only Camels for 30 days. Enjoy Camel's rich, full flavor. And see how well Camels agree with your throat. Pack after pack, week after week. See for yourself why Camels are so popular with the doctors of America.
Mortal Kombat X, released in 2015, could be bought in multiple versions, one which included an extra $40 dedicated solely for 8 extra characters that had not been announced yet. The WB trusted that people would buy these DLC pre-orders in blind faith, with no knowledge beforehand that one of the characters would end up being Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. In a continuation of the story from Mortal Kombat 9, Mortal Kombat X retells the story of Mortal Kombat 4, but less poorly, and then jumps forward in time 20 years to see what would have happened if all of the original fan-favorite characters had been given a chance to grow old. While just as polished as Mortal Kombat 9's story had been, many were upset at how the story focused on characters like Sonya Blade and Johnny Cage too heavily, while ignoring the far more interesting backstories of newcomers like Erron Black and Farrah Tor. Again, the story is told through cinematic sequences with the occasional irrelevant QuickTime events interspersed with story-relevant fight moments. The crypt in MKX continues to be a first-person exploration experience, but the visceral, dramatic gore of MK9 has been replaced once again with stone coffins. Different types of coffins, sure, but they lack the satisfaction of Mortal Kombat 9's ridiculously bloated stomachs and quarter racks. Exploration is more the focus of this game's crypt, and small inventory puzzles peppered throughout the graveyard and the surrounding areas, as well as the return of the Mortal Kombat Deception-style time chest, although with a much more forgiving time frame, help to keep unlocking items fresh. These secrets, of course, are all just extra levels, background music, costumes, and the now obligatory background art. There are no secret arcade fights in Mortal Kombat X like there was in 9, and no characters that need unlocking via story mode at all. Anything not readily apparent must be purchased, not with time or cheat codes, but with money. Jason Voorhees, Bo' Rai Cho, Tremor, Tanya, Predator, Alien, they're all available to you for the low price of 2/3 of the original game. And maybe they'll throw in a few more classic costumes. These types of money-hungry policies aren't exclusive to Warner Brothers. Mortal Kombat has re-released their own games with extra characters and levels since the SNES era. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, Trilogy, Gold, all of these were re-releases that could have simply been DLC in a different time. That hasn't stopped them from doing the same thing with the most recent re-releases either, with Mortal Kombat 9 being repackaged as Mortal Kombat Complete Edition, and the sequel now going by MKXL, which kind of messes with the whole Roman numeral thing if MKX is supposed to mean 10. And we think it does because now we have MK11, which when written looks suspiciously like Mortal Kombat 2. The currently most expensive version of MK11's pre-orders costs $300, and it comes with a 1-to-1 scale Scorpion Mask replica and a Dragon Magnet. However, the game does boast a brand new gimmick of customizable armor and clothing sets which seem perfectly suited to monetization, and there is already talk of which characters and how many will be DLC. As far as cathartic violence goes, MK11 seems to be right on par with the past games in the series. X-rays, first introduced in MK9 as a special meter reliant, can now be performed by any player regardless as long as their health has reached 30% or below. These visceral attacks offer close-up, medically informative information about the type of attack being done. But while visually satisfying, many of these X-rays begin to feel repetitive due to their length and frequency at which inexperienced players tend to fall back on them as defensive maneuvers. As far as the story goes, the convolution of the timeline continues as MK11 picks up immediately following the events of MKX, but with the addition of another new, hitherto unmentionable deity that has been observing events from outside the timeline. While not an altogether new idea, MK11's plot, for the moment at least, promises to escalate the nonsense and confusion to even greater levels as we once again show Liu Kang fighting Liu Kang, and move away from Shao Kahn as a story villain, but still remembering to sell him as a pre-order bonus at the same time. And that about brings us up to speed with the history of the series. There's a few highlights that we glossed over that will be important moving forward. 1. Mortal Kombat, while eventually finding itself comfortable on home consoles in the present day, was by and large an arcade-focused experience for the first decade of its existence. Part of the mass stumble that the series took around the MK4 era in part had to do with the cultural shift away from arcade experiences in exchange for at-home online interactions, and the uncomfortable 3D engine Midway used did little to encourage players to make a special effort to seek out the game. This arcade-oriented mentality also attributed to the extreme difficulty and short fatality time limits of the early games. We can see, as the series moved more towards a focus on home console gaming, how the length of the fatality window increased and the overall punishing difficulty of the AI was toned down. The inclusion of moves lists on pause screens is perhaps the largest indicator of this shift. 2. The team at NetherRealm Studios has consistently known that the violence and controversy that surrounds the series is one of its strongest selling points. They see themselves as the alternative, the cool guy in class, even today as the age of their game series overshadows the age of many of their core fans. Undeniably, Mortal Kombat is much tamer than some indie games on Steam, and it even doesn't go as far as games like Hatred in certain ways. The violence behind MK games is childlike, winking along with you at the ridiculousness of it all. It knows you can't rip a spine out of someone's back in such a clean manner, but who cares? It looks funny. That's just one of the reasons why characters like Jason, Freddy Krueger, and Kratos were chosen to be guest characters. It's the gleeful violence that they enact. 3. Secrets are so easily discoverable these days. It's nearly impossible, simply given the sheer volume of connected players, to keep something hidden for very long. Mortal Kombat 9 was the last game that had even any true hidden fights, and any truly hidden characters haven't been available since Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. Hidden characters in this context refers to accessible characters not visible on the character select screen, a la Blaze, Meat, and Mocap. And hidden fights, like Jade and Reptile from MK's 9, 1, and 2, were absent from MKX. The Crypt brought back Time Chest and had some surface-level puzzles, but nothing was hidden like we know the MK team is capable of hiding. In Mortal Kombat Deception, there were certain chests that only appeared in one location for one game hour on one day out of the week. The chances of you randomly stumbling across such a secret on your first time through were astronomically low. These days, unfortunately, game publishers don't want to take the kind of chance that someone might miss their content. All players, of all skill levels, must have the chance to play every aspect of the game. Arcade fight too hard? Don't worry, use the skip fight token. Can't put in these button combos? Here's an easy fatality token. Out of tokens? Don't worry, you can buy some with real money. What frustrates me about this particular type of monetization, besides the fact that developers may change their gameplay in order to encourage it, is that it is essentially meaningless. To skip a fight without winning or to perform a fatality without pressing buttons in order undermines the entire concept and purpose of the game itself. But when displayed en masse to the general public, to children and adults, I understand how easy it could be to become susceptible. Had I been presented with the option to turn Sindel into a moth for the low price of $1, perhaps I might have paid for it as a child. But if I had, that experience would have been fleeting, unremarkable. I would have pressed the button, she would have done it, I would have said, cool, and then the day would continue as normal. But because the animalities were so well hidden within the game, because there was no moves list on the pause screen, we were able to turn the execution of one simple finishing move into the highlight achievement of the entire weekend. Pedantics could argue that the entire afternoon could have been ruined with a copy of a Prima Game strategy guide, and maybe that's true. However, that wasn't the situation that I found myself in on that afternoon in 1996. I was just a kid with a game, excited to uncover any new gameplay that I could, and I was excited because it wasn't spelled out for me. There was no training mode that I could jump into unless I wanted to play versus by myself with both controllers. Simply trial and error and the telephonic information passed on by a temporarily crippled friend was all I had to go on.
What a wonderful difference. Montclair's menthol is in the tip, not in the tobacco. Remember, all other menthol cigarettes put their menthol in the tobacco. Only Montclair puts it in the tip.
Ugh. This stuff is foul.
It goes on the face, not in it?
Golden Tobaccos freshens the flavor the whole smoke through so it never tastes dry or bitter. Montclair's filter adds to your smoking pleasure instead of taking it away.
Montclair's last puff tastes as fresh as the first puff. Montclair's last puff tastes as fresh as the first puff. Because Montclair's menthol is in the tip,
not in our fine tobacco.
Smoke Montclair modern cigarettes. Smoke Montclair modern cigarettes.
The only cigarette that puts the menthol in the tip.
So perhaps my own view is skewed from the filters of nostalgia and age. Perhaps my more than expected number of decades on this earth is giving me a sense of perspective different than your own. Such is the folly of solo examination and of existence itself. As stated previously, I have done my best during this historical documentation process to eliminate my own biases as much as possible. I believe I have done an adequate job of this, so for the moment, let us proceed with some conclusions and extrapolations. The fan reception of Mortal Kombat 11 has been very positive so far, with many players excited about the recent combat reveal, the updated graphics, character personalization, and the new characters. To get an alternate view of this, I recently posed a question to the Mortal Kombat subreddit to see if there was anything about it that disappointed players. I received a number of responses, and the top-rated ones go as follows. Number 1. The removal of the run mechanic. Number 2. The graphics seem too flashy yet slow, something WB superhero injustice-y. And 3. Fatal blows and cinematic moves being too strong and too violent without any lasting effects. Those hoping MK11 would be more like MK9 than Injustice 2 were severely disappointed, but they shouldn't be surprised. NetherRealm Studios, even back when the team was a division of Midway, was always building, expanding, and then tearing up their games in order to try something new. Mortal Kombat 2 doubled the amount of fighters from Mortal Kombat 1 and added other worlds, monsters, and villains to the lore. Mortal Kombat 3 combined the real-world setting from the first game with all of the fantasy aspects of the second. In the PS2 era as well, we see the fresh slate with Deadly Alliance, the refinement with Deception, and the overabundance and expansion in Armageddon. And now here we are at the end of our third act in the Mortal Kombat theater, one which began with Mortal Kombat 9 and will most likely end with 11. Rumors and leaks of the next generation of consoles have already begun, and given the usual 2 to 3 year development time that exists between Mortal Kombat releases, it makes it extremely unlikely that another full release will happen in this generation of gaming, at which point the MK series is likely to reinvent itself in some other new way. What that way is may be impossible to determine at this time. Given current fandom and brand recognition / legacy status, the NetherRealm is free to experiment with their series up till it simply isn't fun for the hardcore fans anymore. Perhaps they might tweak their fighting system in such a way to completely turn off the esports players, but that is unlikely given their level of studio openness and association with talented and dedicated esports personalities. Mortal Kombat 11 will sell either very well or good enough for Warner Brothers, and downloadable content combined with online play will keep players invested for at least a year or more after release, at which point everyone will be thinking about the next big leap in technology. The next few years, barring some sort of catastrophe, will be adequately profitable to warrant another sequel, and whatever gimmicks the new hardware will offer will most likely prove too tantalizing for NetherRealm Studios to resist. And even then, if they make multiple mistakes with a new engine and release a subpar product like a next-generation Mortal Kombat 4, the 25 years plus of brand recognition means that Warner Brothers will simply have to sit on the IP for 5 years or so to allow nostalgia to rebuild. And even then, they can just simply reboot the franchise. In 2019, more than ever, with reboots even of Aladdin and the Lion King on the horizon, in the world that Shenmue 3 exists, No franchise is ever truly gone forever.
I didn't play Mortal Kombat until Mortal Kombat 2. I didn't play the first one when it first came out. I was barely into like the NES. You know, I was still messing with that, and I never really got out to arcades. But then my cousin got a Sega, and then we played 2 and 3. 3 was probably our favorite, but we used to go over to this kid's house all the time, and he would show us all the animalities and, you know, and all that stuff. And that was around Mortal Kombat 3 is when we really got into it and started really getting into the lore. And Nightwolf from 3 is probably still one of my favorite characters from Mortal Kombat to this day, and I really hope we get him in the new game.
What was Nightwolf doing?
Nightwolf, from what I understand, like, he was housing Liu Kang's spirit or something. Like, he was host to Liu Kang's spirit. That's canon.
I thought Liu Kang was the king of the NetherRealm now.
He is, but he's a revenant. Like, he's not really Liu Kang.
So Nightwolf has Liu Kang's actual spirit?
Actual real spirit, yeah.
Does he have other people's spirits?
I don't know. I think it's just him and, you know, him and Liu Kang.
Oh, this series. Convoluted nonsense.
Quan Chi, I have served our Lord Shinnok well in the destruction of Earth's warriors.
Yes, we are most appreciative of your efforts.
Now I wish to return in time to my home world before it was destroyed at the hands of Shao Kahn. As the new ruler supreme of all reality, Shinnok alone has the power to grant me this wish.
You dare make such an impetuous request from your lord and master?
It is a simple request for one of such great power.
It is also not worth his attention.
I demand it. If it were not for warriors such as myself, his attack against Raiden's forces would have failed.
Perhaps you can convey your feelings to Shinnok himself.
What?
Infidel! You are in no position to demand anything. I could kill you with a mere thought.
But we had a deal.
A deal? I am not a god of my word, reptile. All deals are off.
Those hoping that we may still get another game in Mortal Kombat canon this generation, something akin to Shaolin monks or mythologies, have a low probability of having their wishes answered. We haven't spoken much of Shaolin monks, and that's both of no consequence and also no accident. The game was fine mechanically and satisfying for devout fans, retelling Mortal Kombat 2 from multiple perspectives and only retconning events when absolutely necessary, but it felt more like fan fiction from the game's own creators more than an expanded version of the universe. Shaolin monks was the retribution and justification for both mythologies and special forces, and although it may seem like NetherRealm would be interested in another RPG/story standalone game, one must consider both the story modes of the present-day Mortal Kombat and Injustice games and the simple existence of Injustice itself. With 2 separate franchises that each have their own persistent online maintenance and update requirements, NetherRealm is simply too stretched to the limit as it is already. To add another project, especially one with lower sales predictions than their flagship titles, would be a highly unlikely decision. If one does occur, odds are that its main reason for existence would be to stall and increase the development time of a next-generation proper sequel. Mortal Kombat's legacy, not that one, is ongoing. Very few franchises have reached that level of popularity that Mortal Kombat has even once, and somehow amid the resurgence of home developers, indie games, and worldwide connectivity, it has stayed popular and relevant. While they may never again do something as monumental to gaming's history as to cause the creation of the ESRB, only time will tell how, if ever, the series will draw to a close. Personally, I don't really care. I've had my glory days with the series, and they've long since gone, been buried, unearthed, revived, and then buried again. I hold no personal illusions that I can ever enjoy the games like I did as a child, and so it's time to step aside and let the franchise go on without me.
We part on good terms, and even if NetherRealm and the WB both close up shop and the future of the series goes dark, the old games will always be there. In 2028, if we're all still alive, my son will be 7 years old, and I'm willing to bet that the Super Nintendo in my attic will work just as good then as it does now. As the last line in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises goes, isn't it pretty to think so?